Well, I think it's time to start. We are 39 participants, which is absolutely brilliant. Welcome everybody for the official launch of Extinction Rebellion Trade Unionists. I'm Clara Paylard from the PCS Union and Unite community. I will be chairing the meeting today, and thanks so much for asking me to play this role. I'm really honored. I've been a rank and file trade unionist since 2008, and I served as branch secretary for PCS Liverpool Museums for that period. I was also the president of PCS Culture Group, representing 4,000 museum workers across the country. For 12 years, I've worked in trying to bring trade unionists and climate activists together, campaigning against fracking or oil sponsorship in museums in particular. In 2015, during the COP21 in Paris, I was arrested in the Louvre Museum for taking direct action against the sponsorship of French oil giant Total. So I'm very delighted that today we are forming a trade union branch of XR, bringing together workers and trade unionists into this great movement. And on the eve of the Extinction Rebellion, the April Rebellion, we are making the links between climate activism and workers' collective action. So we are delighted that you can join us to discuss how trade unions and climate activists can work together to align the fight for workers' justice with global climate justice. We do recognize that the climate crisis, as well as the exploitation of workers, resources, and the natural world are closely linked and caused by a system of capitalism and imperialism. We understand the importance of direct action in workers' struggles and the crucial role of direct action to act now about the climate emergency. We also understand that tackling climate change means changing our current economy, modes of productions, and it will have a huge impact on workers employed in fossil fuel industries and other pollutive industries, as well as on many communities across the world. We demand a just transition, a real just transition for those workers and those communities. They must be leading the change, and our movement must support them so they don't pay the price of the solutions to the climate crisis. We recognize that communities and people in the global south have done least to cause the climate crisis, but they are the most affected by the impact of climate change now. So we intend to link up with trade unionists in the global south, and this event is the first of a series of events and action we will be planning forward. XR Trade Unionists calls on all trade unionists to join XR and on all XR rebels to join a trade union. We want to promote concerns about the climate crisis within our trade unions and the trade union movement. We aim to support trade unions and workers' strikes and ensure that the withdrawal from fossil fuel include a just transition for workers. We will lobby for XR actions to include consultation and to link our actions with trade unions and to promote strike as an effective form of non-violent direct action in the fight for climate justice. This is our mandate. Today, we're going to hear from three great speakers that I'm going to introduce in a moment. They'll speak for about 10 minutes each. Then we will have about half an hour for questions and mainly discussions, really. And finally, we will wrap up the event with what our next step could be and what can you do as trade unionists who want to become active in the XR movement. We will record the speakers today, but not the discussion. Anyway, enough of me, and I'm now delighted to introduce our three great speakers. First, we are going to hear from Finlay Asher. Finlay is a mechanical engineer who spent 7 years at Rolls-Royce working on aircraft engine design. He's a founder of Safe Landing, which is a group of climate-concerned aviation professionals working in airline, airports, engineering, and factories. They are concerned about the current trajectory of the industry, and they oppose the expansion of airports. Finlay is also a member of Unite and active in XR Trade Unions. Then we will hear from Chantal Lund. Chantal is a member of Unite community, and she's the founder of Merseyside Black Lives Matter Alliance. She's also the chair of the Merseyside Alliance for Racial Equality. She's working in children's social care for years before a short stint in the police, which she left due to racism. She's also founder of the Kill the Bill Coalition and a campaigner for climate justice. Today, I'd like to bring solidarity to Chantal on behalf of the group, as she's been excluded from the Liverpool Anti-Racist Festival on political grounds, and we've drafted a statement of support to put to the meeting later on. Maybe Angela, somebody else can share this statement in the chat, and we'll come back to it later. And finally, last not least, Daniel Randall. Daniel is a London underground worker and an active rep for the RMT Bakerloo branch. He's been active in supporting a number of industrial disputes, including by London underground cleaners, and has been campaigning for climate justice. So thanks to all three for joining us, in particular Daniel, who is joining during his break at work. So we'll have to leave by 3. So once the speakers are finished, if there is any specific question for Daniel, we'll take those first. But first of all, I'd like to invite Finlay to address the meeting. Finlay.
Thanks, Clara. Hey, everybody. Nice to be here. I think this is a really important topic. And great to be part of this panel with the other speakers. So my name's Finlay, I'm up in Scotland. As Clara was saying, I used to design aircraft engines, and now I run this group called Safe Landing, which has a lot of different workers from within the aviation sector that are concerned about climate change. We've got pilots, engineers, cabin crew, maintenance workers, etc. And we're all concerned about the trajectory of the industry, and we're challenging what our industry leaders are saying around the growth of air travel from an environmental perspective, but also from a worker's perspective and from a job security perspective. Okay, now I'm also just going to talk about aviation because it's a really interesting kind of case study. We're very, very dependent on fossil fuel. Like if you fly in an aircraft, 99.9% of the fuel is fossil fuel. And we've seen XR and Just Stop Oil activists blockading oil refineries this week. It's not just, when we think about transitions for workers, we tend to think about oil and gas workers, but really fossil fuel flows everywhere to our economy. So many jobs are linked to fossil fuel use, cars, homes, aircraft, agriculture, etc. We need to think about how all of those jobs within the rest of the economy need to change as well. Now, aviation is also interesting because when we saw in 2019, XR first doing their big demonstrations and started to hear from Greta Thunberg, she sailed across the Atlantic. There's this concept of flight shame. A lot of environmentalists know flying is the fastest way to burn fossil fuels. If you want to burn some oil, quickest way to do so is to get in an aircraft. And our industry, it's sort of we need to recognize that workers do feel under attack. When we say flying is bad, we need to fly less. Immediately, if you work in that sector, if that's your job, if that's what makes you proud, and you see the benefit that you're giving to society in terms of being able to travel, there is a sort of knee-jerk reaction to not disengage from the conversation. But it's so important because workers are what create the industry, they're what drive it, they're what operate it, and we need workers on board if we're going to transform the industry. And it's super important for workers to understand the impact of the industry they work in and how it needs to change so that we can be in control and so that we can be informed, and so that ideally we can guide the direction that our industries go in. So as a group, Safe Landing, we do oppose airport expansion and airline expansion at the moment, because we're really worried. Like the industry at the moment is planning to double the number of flights in the next 15 years. And obviously, as I say, very reliant on fossil fuel, and that will increase fossil fuel use. It will increase greenhouse gas emissions, and it's going to accelerate us blowing our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees C. Now that seems very counterintuitive. If you're an aviation worker, opposing expansion of the industry, talking about regulations, maybe needing to fly less far, etc., doesn't seem right. So why would we do that? Well, we're really worried that just like at the moment, there's been an industry crash due to COVID-19. In the future, if we ignore climate change and the impact of the industry, there's going to be severe consequences, and it might just not be possible to fly at all, or we need to fly a lot less. So we're predicting there might be a massive industry crash in the 2030s, where suddenly it's just not morally acceptable to fly a lot. And actually there's sudden regulations that are very severe that completely change the industry. And if that happens, workers will suffer. There's benefits of flying, but we want to be able to continue to fly into the future. And an industry crash is not going to be good for anybody, but particularly not for workers. And we're likely to see sort of unjust transitions with people being given redundancies or worse terms and conditions, etc. So we think it's really in workers' best interests to understand what is possible in the future. And this goes, this is the same if you think about other industries. Like, we need to drive less, we need to produce less waste, we need to change the way that we eat. And if we are ignoring these things, then we're just not going to understand what the future of society and the future of economies is going to be like. And there's going to need to be a massive, very quick change that's going to make everybody suffer. So for example, as well, like an incinerator, there's stuff around there. If you work in an incinerator, it might feel good if there's another one being built, there's more short-term jobs, an airport's expanding, more short-term jobs as well. But if fundamentally that's not a good thing for the climate, and in 10 years' time we need to close that facility down, then those jobs are not long-term, secure, stable jobs. So yeah, as a group, we're really trying to emphasize that workers need to understand how the industry is going to change. Particularly, we need to look at technological solutions and look at the reality of those. So within the aviation industry, there's a lot of talk of electric aircraft, hydrogen, biofuels, electrofuels. You might have heard of all of these things, or advanced designs. And there's a lot of greenwash. So we're really keen that we challenge our leaders and look at the reality of technology, what's actually possible. And I won't go into any of that stuff today, but we know that a lot of this technology isn't going to be ready in time. The next 10, 15 years, we're just going to be using the same type of aircraft, business as usual expansion of airports and airlines. And that means that actually we're going to need policies. And we need to understand those policies as workers and make sure our industry is ready for them, or we're not going to be there kind of understanding what the transition is going to involve and being able to influence that as workers. So just on that as well, within aviation, some of the solutions proposed, you might have heard of carbon offsetting or biofuels. These are things, when you look into them, they've actually got massive impacts, particularly in the global south. So offsetting in biofuels tends to use land, can often mean deforestation, can mean land grabs, it can mean lots of pesticide, fertilizer use that causes air and pollution, sort of air and water pollution, for local populations. As a group, we've gone and looked at some of the biofuel refineries that are being built for aviation in Paraguay, and in the impacts that those have, and it's leading to massive deforestation in Paraguay. So as workers, we also need to have solidarity with workers and communities in other countries and really understand false solutions that our industry is pushing on others. Because fundamentally, if it's not good for the environment, socially and environmentally, it's not going to be a long-term solution. And trying to kid ourselves with that is just going to lead to us needing to completely change things in the future too. So yeah, so one of the things we are advocating for is workers' assemblies, where workers get in experts and specialists to inform them, similar to citizens' assemblies that you might have heard about Extinction Rebellion talking about. Now, one of the key things about citizens' assemblies is understanding that our leaders, whether they're political leaders or industrial leaders, they only have a time horizon of a few years, maybe 5 years at most. They'll be out of office, somebody else will be in the 2030s. If you're a CEO, you care about quarterly profits. You don't care about what's going to happen in the 2030s because you will have left, taken a payout, got your bonuses, and you'll be out the door and it'll be someone else's problem. But as citizens and as workers, we want a career that's going to last 20, 30 years. And it really matters to us what happens in the 2030s. So we need to understand this distinction of priorities and time horizons. And it's really down to us to secure our own future So we need to be informed, and we need to be part of a decision-making process for how our industry evolves and how it transforms, so that we can change our industries by design rather than late disaster. So that, as I say, workers' assemblies, and we're advocating for trade unions to carry these out and come up with their own alternative visions for the future of the aviation industry, and likewise other industries as well. So that's me. That's just a brief background to Safe Landing. Thanks for having me, and I'll pass on to the next group.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Finlay. I think it's so important to have, aviation workers to be with us, and it's really inspiring the work you're doing. And I've shared in the chat the Safe Landing website, which is a great resource, and they've got linked to, many useful resources to engage with aviation workers on this website. So thank you. And next, I would like to invite Chantal to address the meeting. Chantal.
Hello guys, the group beside me have got quite rowdy, so I imagine you can hear them now. So I'm just going to try and speak as loud as I can into my mic. But when we talk about environmental activism and we talk about the climate crisis, I think at a level of workers and at a working class level, it's often seen as an issue that's kind of all the way over there, as in physically far away from us, and also an issue that is predominantly a middle to upper class issue that's advocated around, and an issue that most people I speak to, they're a bit like, but it's not really our issue, is it? It's not really something that we have a voice in, or that we have we're a part of because of the way it's packaged. And obviously I'm a campaigner for BLM, and I'm a BLM activist and a trade unionist. And when we talk about BLM's a global movement, and when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and we're talking about the Black diaspora, and if we look at the diaspora and we look at former colonies, colonialism has basically been replaced by corporatization, and a lot of the countries that have contributed the least in terms of the climate emergency actually feel the impact more sharply, like Guyana, which has got rising sea levels, and countries which are hit with flooding and droughts. Asia, African continents are going to be without food, without water, and there's very much going to be a rush to be attaining these natural resources, and a big war and a big fight over them. But as trade unionists, I think that sometimes we frame a lot of things as workplace issues and issues within the workplace, and that's what we primarily concern ourselves with, and rightly so, because we have a lot of big fights in the workplace. If you look at the 800 P&O workers at the moment, we have to respond to 800 people losing their jobs. We have to do that right now. But a big part of workplace issues is the lived experiences of workers. So, when we talk about jobs, when we talk about job security, what do jobs and job security matter? What do those things matter if when you get home as a working class person, you can't breathe because respiratory illnesses are rising, and because of where we sit proximally in society as the working class, we're not more likely to be closer to factories, main roads. Our quality of life, it's not a problem just over there on the other continent, it's a problem right here, right now. Our quality of life, recently London got shut down because the pollution levels have risen so high that people were told not to leave the houses. So what's the point of job security and all these amazing things if we're actually going to die earlier, if we're not leaving a planet behind for our young people? And if this global industry, which is under capitalism, like we really do have to talk about capitalism, this global industry under capitalism is so fragile. It's based on the exploitation of people and resources. And in nowhere within the capitalist lens is this idea that there are limits to growth. And that's what we really need to be conscious of. There are limits to growth. It can't go on. We can't go on making cars. We can't go on mass producing and consuming. And yes, it has created jobs, but it's also destroying our planet to the point that they were saying back in the 70s, we're reaching the limits to growth. We need to do something now, like at this moment in the 70s, in order for us to avoid this catastrophic climate emergency. We're now at the point that they were predicting in the 70s, where they didn't know what was going to happen. And yet climate activists are saying, we need to do something now. We're saying the exact same things. that he was saying in the 70s. And there's a lot of gaslighting going on, at a corporate level and at an organizational level, because most organizations that you can see, they can point you to a shiny, environmental greenwashing statement that is telling you they're doing something to save the planet. But when you look at the actions, they are still causing harm on a massive scale, and they're causing harm to this planet, and they're not actually doing anything. McDonald's can make all of the cardboard straws in the world, but that is not going to save us from where we're at. And corporate responsibility is one thing, but corporate actions are another. We've still got tech companies dumping technology in Nigeria at a disproportionate rate. We've still got companies who are making a financial decision that they are going to avoid their responsibilities to this planet because the fines that are put in place when they do break those laws, it's far easier to make a profit. So it's like they will actually account those fines into their decision-making process of, we'll dump a load of technology in Nigeria and we'll pay the fine because it's cheaper than actually recycling. It's cheaper than not constantly making new technology. So as workers, it's absolutely our responsibility, and as trade unionists, to be fighting for climate justice, because at this point there is not going to be a future. Like, I read a post the other day that basically said that children who are born at the moment will never know a calm climate, and they'll never know an environment that's actually stable, because that's the point that we're at. Like the other day, there was a day where we had about 10 different weathers, and people are going, isn't it strange? And we're still at a conversation where people aren't making the connection that it's not strange. Like, this is actual global warming. This is actually where we're at. The planet is dying and nobody is doing anything. But from a trade unionist perspective, from every way you look at it, this is an issue. This is an issue of corporations. Most of us work for massive organisations because small and independent businesses have been decimated by capitalism. And workers do have the power. If we consciously know that the organisations that we are working for are contributing to this climate emergency and are doing nothing about it, then we have the power. And as Clara was saying, we are at the point of tools down, and we are not going to move till this changes, because it's not only the lives overseas, it's not only lives in the former colonies, and they call it developing world, but I call them recovering worlds, because they're recovering from what the colonies did, and they're recovering from the damage that was caused there, especially to national resources. There's not going to be any of that left. There's no point having a job if our working conditions, if our home conditions, if our life conditions are being destroyed. So this is absolutely an issue. And it can't be an issue that we are only going to get around to when we've got time. It can't be something that we're only going to discuss when there's a global environmental day that the corporations want to kind of celebrate and put loads of pictures of the planet and do some really lovely posts, a bit like, the Black Lives Matter Square that they did. It can't just be a day. It has to be embedded into actions and conversations each and every day. But we really do need to be making these conversations accessible to workers. And we really do need to be letting workers know that this is your fight too, because there is a bit of a hierarchy in environmentalism. It's one where many communities of colours don't feel like they have a voice, and one where many workers don't feel like they've got a place within it. We need to be opening it up and saying, this is something that you are a part of. This is something that you need to be fighting for, because at the end of the day, while they're all flying off in the rockets to go and check out another planet, this is something that we as the workers will be dealing with the aftermath of. So it's, it's more than imperative. Like, it's the end game. That's all I can describe it as now. We are in the end game, and what we do now impacts the life and the environment that our children grow up around. But while these organisations and these capitalist systems do seem huge and gigantic and really hard to kind of fight against, if anyone's read about Chris Smalls, this is like a small bit of inspiration. He's an Amazon worker. It was fired because he raised concerns about COVID-19 and the conditions that people were working in. And in America, it's not legal to unionize, and they did like a hate campaign against him when he tried to, but he was the first person in America to create a union within Amazon. And I think if one Black factory worker can take on Amazon and win and create a union, which means they can fight against working conditions, then all of us as workers can take on these corporations and these huge organizations and say, we will not work for you. We will not contribute to the harm that you are causing to this planet anymore. So solidarity to anyone who's fighting for this planet, and solidarity to you all, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal, for your important points. And I think, as activists in the UK, we must absolutely remember that the majority of people impacted in the world by the climate crisis are actually located in the global south, and they are part of the global majority of people of color. So they absolutely need to lead this fight and to be included into activist spaces like XR. We also need to remember that carrying out a direct action in the UK is very different than carrying out direct action in South Africa or South America or some country in Asia. And our Black comrades in the UK are much more likely to be arrested, condemned by justice. So we need to make sure that our spaces are inclusive and that everybody is welcome to participate. Without further ado, I'm now going to invite Daniel to address this meeting. It's great to have you during your break, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks, Clara. Thanks, comrades. Yeah, so I'm on my break in the station that I work at. The room I'm in is connected to the station tannoy. So there is a small possibility there'll be some London Underground related announcement that will come over the sound system at some point. I hope that won't be too disruptive. Just to reiterate from Clara's introduction, I work on London Underground as station staff, and I'm a rep for the RMT union, although I'm speaking in a personal capacity here today. Thanks very much to XR Trade Unionists for the invite. What I'm going to be talking about is the idea of a worker-led transition plan for public transport in London and how that links to, or might potentially be linked to, immediate struggles that we're facing as transport workers. And I'm going to try and situate that within the kind of political work of the sort of struggle environmentalism that I think this network is has been founded to promote. So my workmates and I went on strike recently at the beginning of March for 2 days to defend jobs, pensions and conditions. And depending on which source you get the estimate from, our strike action is reported to have cost the London economy somewhere in between 50 and upwards of £100 million. And another way of thinking about that figure is that me and my workmates generate upwards of £50 million of wealth, of value for the economy just by turning up to work every day. And I think that's a good and important kind of reminder and indication of the power that workers have. You know, we make society move in a very literal and direct sense for me and my workmates. And I think that's it's useful to kind of anchor ourselves in that, you know, the reality of labour as the force that makes society move. And when we're thinking about agencies for change, we're likely to be on strike again soon, and jobs, pensions and conditions are under attack because the Tories have forced Transport for London, the transport provider, onto an unsustainable funding model, and are insisting on job cuts and pension reform as a condition for kind of further funding bailouts from the government. TfL is the only major metropolitan transport provider of its type in the world not to receive regular state subsidy. The Tories insist that TfL should be self-financing, basically exclusively reliant on fare revenue. And that means in a context where passenger levels haven't recovered to pre-pandemic levels, that means the ongoing imposition of austerity cuts on the capital's transport system. I think very clearly that's bad for passengers. For example, there's a proposal now to cut 600 positions from stations, which is not going to be good for accessibility. It's clearly bad for workers, both directly employed workers like me and outsourced workers. Sadiq Khan is now using this financial crisis as a pretext for continuing the outsourcing of services like cleaning, saying it's, you know, too expensive to bring it in-house. And clearly an underfunded public transport system is also very bad for the environment. So as a group of workers, for us as transport workers, but I think this is a good principle for workers in general, it's important to seek opportunities to turn defense into attack, let's say. So not only to resist the employer's cuts, but to propose our own vision for how TfL as a workplace for us, but also as a transport system could be reshaped and reimagined. And there's obviously a lot of parallels, I think, in terms of what I'm going to talk about with what Finlay was saying about, you know, a kind of worker transition for his industry. And in that, I'm looking quite directly, as I'm sure Finlay and his comrades are, to the legacy of the Lucas Plan for inspiration. I probably don't have to explain too much about that to an audience of climate activists and trade unionists, but just in case, that the Lucas Plan was a transition plan developed by manufacturing workers at Lucas Aerospace in 1976, which proposed to use workers' skills to repurpose the productive capacity of their factories away from manufacturing military hardware and towards socially useful and environmental production, things like healthcare equipment and renewable energy technology. The Lucas plan was drawn up as a response to a proposed restructure by the bosses that threatened thousands of jobs. So it was, in other words, precisely an attempt to turn defense into attack. And the Lucas workers' struggle was ultimately defeated, but I think it provides an approach that we can learn from and develop today. So my union, RMT, already has policy at regional level to develop and advocate what we call a workers and passengers plan for the transformation of the transport system, including, and I would argue quite centrally, in terms of its environmental impact. Discussion around the sort of composite elements of that plan, and particularly its environmental facets, is ongoing within the union. And for reasons of time, I'm not able to go into sort of particularly expansive detail about that, but I can say in sort of summary that it will need to combine political demands around funding and governance with workplace demands around hours, conditions, direct employment for outsourced workers. And I think it needs to have a specifically ecological focus as well. So for example, there's a scheme currently in place under a small section of Northern Line track to convert waste heat from the running of the tube into domestic heating supply. And London Underground and TfL love to broadcast this as an example of their like green climate conscious credentials, but it's been in place under that small section of Northern Line track for quite a long time, and there haven't really been particular efforts to expand it. So I think, you know, that's an example of something that a kind of worker-led transition plan could get its hooks into and say, okay, we want to see this expanded and not just run as a token thing to give the bosses kind of green cover. I think there's sometimes a tendency, and some of the things Finlay said resonate with this as well, including amongst public transport workers ourselves, to think of our work as kind of already existing green collar work, which simply just needs kind of expanding and rolling out. And obviously, I'm very much in favour of a radical expansion of public transport, but a worker-led transition to zero carbon production isn't something that can be limited to industries like energy generation or even aviation. I think we need to think in terms of a Lucas plan, the Lucas plan type approach for every industry and sector. So how do we fight for all of this? Radical demands are great, but without any agency capable of imposing them, they're just a sort of wish list of nice ideas. And the scale of workers' struggle needed to force concessions like this from the bosses and the state can't be conjured up at will. We've got a lot of rebuilding to do, despite a recent uptick. Strikes are still at a kind of historically low ebb in this country. One thing I wanted to mention here, which might seem tangential to the main topic, but which I think has to be linked to it, is the question of anti-trade union legislation, which is a real obstacle to the kind of action we need. Britain has some of the most restrictive anti-union laws of any democratic country. It's incredibly difficult for workers to organise effective industrial action on any kind of rapid timescale. We're prevented from striking legally in solidarity with other workers and over so-called political issues. And the current government has a manifesto commitment to bring forward new legislation to impose what it calls minimum service requirements during transport strikes, which would essentially ban all-out strikes in my industry. I'm proud to say that my union's recent AGM passed a policy committing us to non-compliance with those laws in the event that they are implemented, but there's no doubt that they will place another obstacle in the path of effective trade unionism. So I think the labour movement needs to redouble our campaign for the repeal of all anti-union laws. And I think the climate movement needs to take up the question of trade union freedom as an immediate and direct priority. So I'm involved in a campaign against anti-union laws called Free Our Unions. And we've recently been working with Earth Strike to develop some of those political linkages. I'll pop some links in the chat about that work when I'm done speaking. And I hope that that's something that XR Trade Unionists might be able to get involved with as well. Despite these challenges and obstacles, however, I still believe, and I'm sure this goes for all of us, hopefully in the meeting, that workers' struggle, action at the point of production, at the place where capitalism kind of happens, or happens in a very fundamental and essential way, linked to political action that draws out the wider social implications of those struggles and expands their horizons beyond the immediate shop floor conflict between worker and boss, I still believe that struggle is an irreplaceable agency for winning the kind of change we need. And I think networks like this one can play an important role in all of this, as Clara said in her introduction, but by building direct solidarity for workers' action within the climate movement, by helping to draw out the possible ecological resonances of workers' struggles and make links to wider demands. I think a lot of what Chantal was talking about really resonates with that. And fundamentally, by encouraging climate activists who may not currently do so to see organisation in their own workplaces and in the labour movement as key terrains for advancing radical environmental politics. For any historians of the climate movement in the audience, I'll mention that I was involved from about 2006 to 2010 in a network called Workers' Climate Action, which aimed to make exactly those kind of organisational and political links between the labour and climate movements, and was able to play a quite a central role in a catalysing role, in fact, in struggles like the Vestas wind turbine workers' factory occupation in 2009, which some people might have heard of. I think that's a history that we can learn from today. None of this will be easy. The confidence to take militant action around even very basic and immediate demands is something that needs to be developed and built. But the crises around COVID and, of course, the climate crisis both pose very acutely the question of class power. Who rules? In whose interests is society organised? It's maybe a little macabre to sort of look for opportunities in moments of social catastrophe, but I think they do open up possibilities for conversations with our workmates that would be harder to start in so-called normal times. And the task of building those bridges between our immediate, often defensive and reactive struggles in workplaces and the struggle to transform society, I'd say the struggle for a socialist society, that task falls precisely to people like us. And it's hopefully out of discussions like this that we can all develop the ideas and strategies to build these struggles in our own workplaces. So victory, of course, is not guaranteed. But if we don't have these fights, then defeat will be. So on that note, I'll finish and thank the organisers again for having me. And I'm looking forward to as much of the discussion as I'm able to stay for. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I think so many really important points, and also a nice roundup of, bringing together some different issues. And so hopefully later we will also hear about some of our next steps, about plans to bring solidarity to some oil workers in struggle. We'll be striking soon, particularly in Foley. So we'll know a little bit more about that later. And, as I said, this is only the start of series of discussions, events and actions. I'm sure we'll be able to learn from some struggle across the world, such as, Filipinos, energy workers, working in solidarity with local communities against privatization of the energy sector, or the New York nurses, supporting the anti-fracking campaigners in the US. But without further ado, I want to thank the three speakers. And now we've got about half an hour of discussions.